Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today we want to return to the subject of DIY NASs, and today we want to kind of refer back to last week's video where we were talking about DIY NAS motherboards and CPU combos. Now on my screen here, revert back there in OBS, a week ago we did this video where I went through at least 5, I think it was almost 6 motherboards that were CPU and motherboard combos that you could buy right now on a number of different retailers, predominantly, let's be realistic, AliExpress. I hate seagulls. And after the course of that video, I was going through the comments because I wanted to see what people were saying. And throughout the course of those comments, it turned out there were a bunch of other motherboards and CPU combos you can buy off the shelf right now, which are absolutely phenomenal for different reasons as a DIY NAS build. So much so, in fact, that I decided to go through them and do a follow-up piece right now with each of those people's comments, raising the motherboard and why they believed it to be worthy of being in that list anyway as a viable alternative. But before we go any further, just a quick disclaimer off the bat. I've already made an article attached to this video that you can see here on screen, and this article here I'm going to be updating with all of the motherboards that I'm going to be talking about today, 2 of which, by the way, I went out and purchased after those comments because I was so impressed and indeed angry at myself for not knowing about them. The other thing I'm going to highlight is comments like this one, which again I completely understand. It does make sense and it's a phenomenal build, and I've seen the B550i board and the other alternative to that floating around quite a lot in the last 12 months or so for DIY NAS builds, but we were focusing predominantly on combined ones that were utilising mobile SoC chips that are pre-soldered to the board, as we're seeing the miniaturisation of a lot of those Ryzen and Intel CPUs. So there were some great suggestions coming through in the comments of complete builds where buying the CPU and the motherboard and everything separate, but I was really trying to focus exclusively on boards that arrived with the CPU pre-attached and pre-soldered in the first place there. So there were some great suggestions, and I do strongly recommend you go down into the comments because you will find gold, and in some locations you can get the CPU included with a cover plate on top. But even then, they don't really count as they're still bundled items that are getting put together there. This is the one that really caught me off guard. The Minisforum. Now, I used to refer to Minisforum Mobos back at the start of 2023 when we started seeing some of those rollouts when everyone was talking TopTon and all of a sudden CWWK boards and Minisforum boards starting to rise to the bubbling to the surface there for these ITX custom Pro Series type boards for NAS. And this board here arriving, and this is going to be the first of 2 AMD motherboards we're going to talk about in today's list. This motherboard here, the Minisforum BD77i and BD790i, and this was from commenter Martin Holthas, I apologise if I butchered that name there, talking about the system he's utilising there. And again, when I dug into it, fair play, man. I can totally see why you went for this. And indeed, even though you didn't go for the higher spec version, you went for the Ryzen 7 embedded processor there. The specifications for even the 7 is pretty darn good. And although, of course, we have to acknowledge a higher TDP on this, which for a 24/7 server can be problematic, we are still talking about an 8-core, 16-thread processor here with some phenomenal power consumption, which is bouncing off, I should say, against that of the power on board. Now, when we went to CPU benchmark there, we could see it was rated at 3200, which again is a relative figure, but again, a 4.1 gigahertz, and that TDP there for variable is not too shabby. And once we dug a little bit more into that CPU benchmark with Geekbench, and we've got another site we're going to be talking about later on, it ranks pretty darn well. And the build quality of this, it's all top loaded as well, and it arrives with pretty much all of the heat sinks and the fans pre-attached. The only downside I could really figure out, you've probably already spotted it, is that single LAN. Now, yes, there is a PCIe slot there, but the coming out the gate with a single LAN is something of a kick in the nadgers, really. Now, if you dig down, you can find some great specs. The main PCIe slot, for example, on the 77i version there, is a Gen 5x16. That's an enormous amount of bandwidth to play with there. But bear in mind, if you're going to start introducing a network upgrade card, that's just a shame to use up such a phenomenally bandwidth heavy slot with, you know, a 10G upgrade card. You'd at least be looking at some serious 25 gig or even a 40 gig card going in there. And once you go down that road, you've really got to factor in just how much SATA storage bandwidth or those NVMEs you're going to be able to utilize there. Overall, it's still an incredible motherboard, and I want to add it to my list, and I wish I'd known about it sooner, because there was one thing that was painfully absent on my list. It was AMD boards there, and the way things have been moving forward with AMD, especially with things like the Star. We are going to finish that video eventually, I promise. It should be said that, you know, there are some great things coming out of AMD embedded Ryzen Mobos. Another one to come up very shortly. And lest we forget, when you really dig into some of the M2 NVMEs on this isn't just M2 NVMe Gen 5 on those, but it's Gen 5 times 4. Now, I was trying to find out more information in the case of both configurations, whether that PCIe was being shared across the M.2s as well, something we're going to talk about a little bit later on with an N100 board coming up soon. But nonetheless, as far as AMD ITX boards go, this thing is absolutely phenomenal. And if you're prepared to get over the baseline 1 gig, 2.5 gig, one single port there on the rear, and you can find a way to leverage that PCIe slot to something more than just a simple NIC. This is a great ITX board there, and in terms of internal power, really a high standard to be set. And don't forget that price point there isn't too shabby. At $389, you're still going to have to roll out the gate with your own memory in your build. For a CPU Mobo combo, that's actually pretty darn reasonable. Now, staying on the subject of AMD, there was this other board that genuinely just caught me by surprise. And as I say in my comments, it came up several times in the comments, but this is probably the most, clear one for me, is the new CWWK board there. Another AMD board. And once you dig into it, man alive, it is something of a beast. This CWWK board here, available in numerous AMD embedded Ryzen configurations, much like we find with the Intel Core series, is rocking out the gate not only with 4 gigabit LAN ports there on the rear, 4 2.5 gigabit LAN ports there on the rear, but it's also rocking out the gate with that incredible CPU on board and a price point there that's, I'm not going to call that price point cheap, but I'm not going to say it's exceedingly high for the kind of performance numbers that we're looking at here. Now, finding listings for this particular CPU motherboard combo on a lot of sites was tough. Obviously, you can go direct to CWWK, but they are asking for a number of the lines when you filter into a lot of the configurations. Some of these are just simply not available at the moment then due to stock issues. And if you dig into, ready-made PCs, you will find it there. But eventually, I was able to find it. AliExpress here at £358, and this is with no extras. You could get it with the big old fan already pre-attached, but really that's, you're getting the traditional CPU combo experience here. But again, just even a casual look at some of these specifications, and also I will add, if we dig a little bit further into those specs, the fact that we're seeing more and more Mobos rocking out with these SAS ports on board, getting around the SATA bottleneck, in terms of physical bottleneck I should say, on ITX motherboards, just physical space and lane allocation. Of course, there are going to be purists that will mark down the fact that it is a Gen 4x8 signal slot on the PCIe, and that the M2 NVMEs are limited to 4x2, but given the overall spec of what we're looking at here in an AMD build, and by the way, this have another little surprise up its sleeve, something I'll talk about later on in the video. Overall, I was just left very, very impressed by this particular combo, and this was just another example of a CPU motherboard combo. I was kicking myself last week that I didn't include. It's the little things. Don't get me wrong, that CPU at 54 watt TDP is still going to be quite high for some, but every tier of that Ryzen family they've applied to this CPU motherboard combo is pretty darn good. And then when you factor in just little, design improvements over some of the other systems out there, for example, the fact that the system's got a couple of USB 2 ports on the board inside, not unusual, does mean that unlock keys and boot disks, again for things like Unraid, are going to be an option. The dual SODIMM slots that are on board being DDR5 there, rather than being a single DIMM or a single SODIMM on such a compact ITX board. And digging further into the SATA drive support there in the AS Media NVIDIA chips they've gone for, you can see that SATA 3 with one of those chips supporting 6 SATA 3 drives and the other one supporting 4 SATA 3 drives is going to allow it a huge amount of storage capability once you really factor in those additional cables. Hence why when you do look online, the majority of the times you see this board being listed, when you can find it, it is being provided with those cables inside. So I recommend you go for it. Ultimately, the build quality on this I find very, very impressive for what you're getting here. And yes, 358 is not a small amount of money, but it's still a very impressive little CPU combo. And of course, the CPU that you arrive with is a matter for debate also. What do I mean by that? Well, when you're looking around, you're finding lots of listings, and again, back to their very own listing themselves, that list multiple CPU components there, but once you break down into it, it's very difficult to find out precisely which one you're going to get. Even when you broke down into this, and you can see there on that main image there, that it says AMD Ryzen 7/9 Bay NAS board, and the CPU it's equipped with, all too often we're finding that CPU is slightly differing in places. Now that might be a configuration deployment thing, it might be a listing, it might just be some bad presentation there. But that was really the only meaningful negative I could come up with, aside from the power consumption on a board like this being ever so slightly higher than I would like. Overall, a great board. Next up from Eve Arden 1991 is the Minisforum AR900i. Now this was only raised one time, and although there was debate in the comments about the BIOS updates required for that with regards to HBA cards, it should be said that it does look like, and I've done a little checking online, there have been BIOS updates for that. Now this is another Minisforum one, and this is arriving with an Intel this time. Now we've seen much when we were talking about the Ying board last week, we were talking about the Ying 13th generation i9, and this is pretty much a similar CPU. However, this is the HX version that really does let things loose. What do we mean by that? Well, when we dig into it there, it's not a cheap CPU by any regard if you're going to try and buy it retail, but of course Intel's prices here are always overinflated. When you look at the base level performance here, we're still seeing that same base 55 watt when needed, much comparable to the two CPU motherboard combos we've talked about thus far, but this one arrives with a phenomenally high clockable total speed there, and a 24 core processor there. Now, how much of those power and efficiency cores you're actually able to utilize, it's hard to say until we've got one here in the room. But I will say that this is probably the board of choice amongst all of them for the power users out there, breaking it down into a phenomenal 44,682 on CPU benchmark. Integrated graphics CPU, unsurprisingly it's Intel Core. Once we break down into some of those specifications there, break it down into that i9 family and just exactly what you are getting for your money, this is a monster one. And then when we take a closer look at the layout of the board, again Minisforum here, Minisforum even, sorry, are using a very similar layout. Again, we've only got that one 2.5 gigabit Ethernet network port there, which is something of a pain in the bum. And once you break down into a lot of the specification that this board is rolling out with, the first thing that I loved, Gen 5x16 slot there and 4x M.2 NVMe slots there. That on its own absolutely fills me with computer lust. That is what I want to see. Now you have to dig a little bit into their main official pages there, but you can find out that there's 2 PCIe Gen 4 slots on the rear and another 2 Gen 4 slots on the top there. And the top 2 also arrive with an active heatsink on the top. There's actually a fan-assisted heatsink included on the top of that board there, going back into that picture. So what we're looking at here is a pretty darn phenomenal layout here of lanes. Not only that, but the storage capabilities here. And once again, once we dig into those images just a fraction closer and find out more about how SATA is distributed onto this, I'm pleased to say that once again we're looking at a very nice layout of components going back in. However, it's not all good news, and I think some of you may already have noticed when we were taking a closer look at this board, and that main fact we have to talk about is, where's the SATA? Where's the HD SAS? Ultimately, there doesn't seem to be a baseline connector there for your traditional bog standard storage. This is going to be a great card for those that are focusing predominantly on flash, which is good to see. But in larger cases where you want some archival storage, you are going to have to work around it. You are going to have to introduce storage cards. You are going to have to find ways and means around it. Now, again, arriving at 549 right now. It's still pretty reasonably priced, and for that hardware configuration and those that want to take advantage of true performance bandwidth on their M2 NVMe's, this is all going to be great to hear. I would be interested to see how much of that is shared out, and when we dug into the FAQ section there trying to find out more about it, although they're happy to tell us it doesn't support ECC memory when it comes to traditional storage or the lane sharing between the main PCIe Gen 5 16 slot and those M2 NVMe's, we couldn't get a particularly clear answer from their own pages here. And there was some contradictory information available on Reddit, but not really much more than that. Ultimately, if you're looking at a flash M2 NVMe system, this definitely trumps the one that I was trying to recommend on mine, because it's simply providing way more than the Ying was able to provide, both in slot and afforded bandwidth and total speed afforded to those lanes. Now, this next CPU motherboard combo isn't really a full recommendation. It's actually a rollback on something we were talking about before, and it was raised by David Westra 8181, and this was to do with the N100 board in the N305 board from TopTon. Now, TopTon, I talked about this board, as I mentioned earlier on, previously in my article. We were talking about not only the TopTon original board, the one that everyone always talks about, the N5105 N6005, but also that new N305i3. And there was, a little bit of give and take in the comments there about that board. But what was interesting was this raised comment here that kind of brought something to my attention that I didn't know, and that was that the first generation of that board was sharing, and we knew that from our original video. We did touch on this, that on that N305, the M2 NVMe, one of the M2 NVMe and the PCIe actually shared that bandwidth, that lane. So the result was that you're actually kind of losing out in a regard. But it turns out that TopTon have readdressed this in the N100 series. And I found several comments on Reddit Online and a few other forums that if you can get hold of the N100 with the green board, the newer released version, and again, they're priced largely identically, this is the one that allows you to take advantage of the M2 NVMe and the PCIe upgrade slot. There's something that wasn't afforded in the other one there. Sadly, as highlighted in the comments and in this Reddit post here, there was mention that the green board currently is only available on that N100, and if you're waiting for the N300 there, or the N305 board there, you're kind of out of luck at the moment. Indeed, the N100 board, and you may have seen it in the image I just showed you there, that N100 board, some of them, of the other board, not this one here, but the N100, some of those actually don't have the PCIe slot on them as well, and they've afforded those lanes elsewhere on the board. It's still useful information, and I am genuinely grateful for David for letting us know on that. Now, the final thing I want to talk about in this video is ECC, error correcting code, or error code correction, depending on which side of the fence you want to live on. And there were several users in the comments of the previous video and a couple of the Jonsbo videos previously that were raising that whenever we talk about M-ITX boards, one, if it was a good ATX board, ECC and the Xeon CPUs that are traditionally associated with it are everywhere. But when it comes to ITX, finding ITX motherboard, M-ITX motherboards for your custom NAS build that arrive with a CPU attached that have ECC are really hard to come by, and for many users, particularly long-term storage veterans, that was something of an absolute deal breaker. And probably one of the most vocal there was Marcus 3D here, talking about effectively, if you don't have ECC, you don't have a NAS, ultimately, to do with data integrity there. But when you dig further into it, it's actually quite hard to find motherboards that have ECC on board. Indeed, when you go to Part Picker and you start looking through, and this is where a lot of the time when I make recommendations to users where they should go, I started looking at M-ITX boards according to their database, which is years upon years upon years upon years old, which have got ECC in. I'll be straight with you, that's not a big list. And once you start factoring in boards that have got the CPU already pre-attached as a CPU Mobo combo, which is the subject of that video and this one, the list gets even smaller. I'm pleased to say, however, that one of the boards we talked about earlier today does support ECC. This is an EC supported board there, which means on those two sodium slots there you've got inside, you can take advantage of ECC, which is pretty darn good. But outside of that, M-ITX boards, you're kind of limited to X Supermicro, X server board, and they arrive with old style Xeons pre-attached. Also, they ain't cheap. If you don't believe me, open up a new tab on your web browser and look up M-ITX ECC CPU Mobo combo. I know that sounds vague. Trust me, lots have looked. And frankly, the results are not great. That's why it's so good that this new board arrives with ECC support on there. Now, again, the Supermicro boards, they're serviceable. They're arriving with the CPU pre-attached there, and some of them are remarkably powerful in terms of cores. Unfortunately, they're also remarkably powerful in terms of power consumption. Some of them breaking into the 100 watts and above, although some of them have got a nice lower 45 to 65 watt TDP when needed. Ultimately, if you're going to go down that road and you're going to go down super powerful Xeon ECC sort of build, then chances are you can pick up some absolute billy bargains on eBay. And if you go on there, you're going to find some solid results to play with overall. And if you're happy to go secondhand, which again a couple of users in the comments did highlight, then there's some very good choices for you there. But you're not going to be getting the most up-to-date boards. You're not going to be enjoying, in some cases, Gen 4 or Gen 5 bandwidth there on the individual M2 NVMEs if they are present. And also, something I don't think gets spoken about enough is when it comes to buying these X Supermicro boards, and I did a Zoom consultation at the end of 2024 on this with someone, finding the manuals for these things fall into two different categories. One, they are non-existent because these are borderline B2B products there. But the other one is they give you the most complex documentation that in some ways you can read it one way or another to become very contradictory. So the support and the clarity on a lot of these X server motherboards and, you know, higher end Supermicro micro or HP boards there can be incredibly incongruous, and definitely something that makes it something more of an intimidating purchase, which for its low price point sometimes, and again we did talk about that in our article here where I started talking about that X99 board there. Although it's an available option, just bear in mind that these things can cost extra money, both in terms of time and in terms of some of the hardware resources you're going to be limited to that are compatible with those boards. But this has been an update to our best CPU and motherboard combos for your DIY NAS. I'm going to be adding all of the results that were added thanks to the comments in the previous video into this article. Alongside that, I will link to them in the description below. Thank you everyone that commented on that video. It was genuinely helpful. I didn't think I'd make a video like this for another few months, and there was just so many comments in that video. I just had to really get to this as soon as possible. So thank you so much for that. Other than that, have yourselves a fantastic weekend, and I'll see you next time.